Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time we followed Jeb to Gettysburg and back to Virginia following the Gettysburg Campaign. Now we move into late 1863 and early 1864. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something at the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Following the Gettysburg Campaign, Stuart's cavalry division grew to a cavalry corps, with some promotions from regimental commanders to brigade commanders. He held reviews nearly every day, not for a spectacle or in any grand manner, but to get the men used to riding with one another and fighting the enemy together. Company Q, that group of broken-down horses and men that Stuart formed, was abolished when it seemed to be growing at an alarming rate, full of unhealthy men and horses, as well as some malcontents and malingerers, men discontented with Stuart's command. Stuart would say, men who are ill or injured should go to the hospital, stragglers should live only in disgrace, and artful dodgers should be shot. As one of Stuart's biographers wrote, in effect, Stuart dealt with morale problems by ordering them to stop. In September 1863, the Union Army of the Potomac began to move against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. This movement came after George Meade, the Union Army commander, found out that James Longstreet and part of his corps was sent to reinforce Braxton Bragg in the west. The Federal cavalry didn't come alone when they probed Stuart's perimeter of Lee's army. They brought infantry and artillery, scattering Stuart's forces and capturing 3 of Jeb's artillery pieces at Culpeper, Virginia. 2 Federal cavalry divisions with infantry and artillery support now converged on Stuart's command, cornering him along the Rapidan River. The tenacious Stuart placed some well-aimed artillery on a hill and launched his own offensive against the forces coming from the south. This allowed him to extricate his command, but it had been close. Union tactics had changed, and Stuart was feeling it gravely. Meade's offensive was cut short when troops from his own army were sent west to deal with the military situation in Tennessee, after the Union defeat at Chickamauga. This allowed Lee to go on the offensive and launch the Bristow Station campaign, where Lee implemented a bold plan, sending his troops north and east to try to get in between Meade and the capital at Washington. The Union Army survived the campaign, and Lee ended Meade's offensive. On this campaign, Stuart's command screened Lee's movements. Jeb encountered Federal cavalry at the old Brandy Station battlefield, but declined to do more than skirmish, being outnumbered. Then, as he watched the Union Army's movements with one brigade near the town of Auburn, he nearly got trapped between an approaching Union corps and the rear guard of another corps. He and his troops hid in a small valley just 150 yards from the Union infantry until all of them had passed. Although it was a tense situation, Stuart gained valuable information about the Union Army's whereabouts and sent word before night fell about where best to attack. The next morning, with the rear guard of the Union Army just 150 yards away, Stuart heard gunfire. It was Richard Ewell's corps engaging with the infantry. Stuart was incredibly happy that Lee was able to send support, and now they could bag the rear guard of Meade's army. Stuart placed his artillery on a hill and let loose a horrendous bombardment into the Union Army camp, scattering the men sitting down to eat breakfast. However, Stuart's artillery barrage made Ewell recoil, thinking that they belonged to the Union Army. The opportunity was lost, and Stuart continued to screen the movement. In the end, Meade got away, and Stuart guarded Lee's army as it moved back across the Rappahannock River. As it guarded the rear of the army, Federal cavalry again came after Stuart's command in force. Stuart had split his command, and the Federal cavalry officer Judson Kilpatrick and his division was chasing after Stuart's half. The other half was commanded by Fitzhugh Lee. Lee and Stuart concocted a plan. Stuart would retreat down the Warrenton Turnpike until the entire enemy division was south of Lee's position. Then Fitzhugh would attack, and they could trap the enemy division between their commands. Stuart retreated a few miles and took up a position behind a ridge. As Kilpatrick drew nearer, Stuart could plainly see the flags and men making up the enemy force, and they were nearing the ridge. Just then, Fitzhugh Lee's guns could be heard behind the force. When the head of Kilpatrick's column turned to face Lee, Stuart sprang the trap. It quickly turned into a chase that lasted 5 miles and got Stuart 250 prisoners and parts of the wagon train, including George Armstrong Custer's spicy letters to a friend, some of which were published in a Richmond paper. The engagement was dubbed the Buckland Races, after the little town that it went through. Kilpatrick avoided putting the incident in his report and Custer claimed that his men faced a mile-long infantry line. In reality, Stuart outsmarted them, and said that the rout of the enemy at Buckland, the most signal and complete that any cavalry has suffered during the war. There was no daring raids in the fall of 1863. Stuart simply conducted great cavalry operations, blocking Federal attempts to probe Lee's lines, and fending off better equipped and more plentiful enemy troops. On November 5th, Stuart held a formal review, which Robert E. Lee attended. It occurred at Brandy Station, and Virginia's governor, John Letcher, and his wife attended. One soldier, tired of the pageantry, said, "General Stuart proposed holding another of his spread eagle grand reviews, which did no good except to give Yankee spies an opportunity to count the exact number of cavalry attached to the Army of Northern Virginia, and to display the foppishness of Stuart, who rode along his war-torn lines with a multitude of bouquets which fair hands had presented to him, fastened in his hat and coat." Also that fall, Flora gave birth to their third child, a girl that Stuart named Virginia Pelham, named after John Pelham, his artillerist, who died earlier that year. James Longstreet, still in the Western Theater, wrote to Stuart and said that the cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest and Joseph Wheeler were like Stuart's command at Bull Run in 1861, not nearly as accomplished or skilled in cavalry tactics as Stuart's command was. Longstreet bemoaned the fact that he didn't have a cavalry officer like Stuart with him in Tennessee and Georgia. Stuart also received bad news at the end of 1863 and into 1864. The horse situation was becoming dire. Feed was hard to come by, with Lee reporting to President Davis that sometimes horses were only able to be given 1 pound of corn per day. Because the government didn't provide horses for the cavalry, horsemen had to bring their own from home, and if they lost an animal to illness or combat, they had to return home on leave to get another mount. For example, Stuart lost 6 horses to illness or combat in the span of 6 months in 1863. His men were suffering. Stuart also was having a hard time getting weapons. Robert E. Lee explained to Stuart that there are many difficulties in the way of arming the cavalry thoroughly, and keeping it in that condition. Few cavalry arms are imported, and those manufactured in the Confederacy are generally rejected. I fear there is great carelessness, too, in the preservation of arms, where infantry arms have been issued to the cavalry. It is stated that they have either been turned in or thrown away in 9 cases out of 10. Federal cavalry were increasingly using repeating carbines, and Stuart's forces were forced to use old infantry rifles to combat them. Around Christmas, Flora came to stay with Stuart at his headquarters. She brought the children, and little Jimmy was now 3.5 years old. He insisted on being called General Jimmy JEB Stuart, Jr., and loved to play around the horses. His father encouraged him to be rough and tumble to give him strength. On Christmas Eve, Stuart held a small get-together for his staff and some invited guests, where they enjoyed singing and storytelling. The group opened up a huge box of oysters, which were frozen, so they tossed them on the hot coals and roasted them until they popped open, then ate them. On December 31st, Stuart went to Richmond and spent some time with his older brother, William Alexander Stuart, who was managing the family's affairs in southwest Virginia. Alex's 11-year-old son, Henry, joined the 2 brothers in their discussion. Jeb wanted to buy a house for Flora in Richmond, and Alex was helping Stuart with the purchase. Henry looked up to his Uncle Jeb, and his admiration only grew. Jeb and Alex talked for a little bit, then Jeb interrupted the conversation and turned to Henry and had a serious conversation about refreshments, and asked Henry what would taste good right then. They went to Pizzini's, a legendary confectioner's shop in Richmond. Jeb bought Henry as many sweets as he could eat right there, and bought some to take home with him. Henry would later say that his uncle was the first adult to talk with him as an equal, man to man, and that meant a lot to the young man. The winter was filled with parties, reviews, inspections, and more, and Stuart traveled between the army around Culpeper and Richmond. At a home in Richmond, he and some other generals played charades, and Stuart flirted with 2 women, Hetty and Constance Cary. While playing the game, Stuart held a ladder for Constance, only if Hetty agreed to go backstage with him in a closet. Stuart flirted so much with Hetty that he forgot to hold the ladder, and Fitzhugh Lee had to step in, while Stuart took a seat in the audience. There was some hearsay at one of the parties that Stuart said not to judge his taste by his wife, that she was extremely homely, but it's doubtful he made such a statement based on all the other loving statements he made publicly about his sweet wife. It seemed that Flora heard the rumors of Jeb's flirtations with women and was concerned about her own reputation. Stuart would write to her saying, "As to being laughed at about your husband's fondness for society and ladies, all I can say is that you are better off in that than you would be if I were fonder of some other things that excite no remark in others. The society of ladies will never injure your husband, and ought to receive your encouragement. My correspondence with the ladies is that kind of correspondence which pertains to the position I hold, and which never could obtain with me were I a subordinate officer. He desperately wanted Flora to have a home of her own, and continued throughout the winter to buy a house. He instructed an associate to travel to St. Louis and collect $5,000 that he had left on a deposit in the Bank of the State of Missouri, and convert it to silver or a bank draft on the Baltimore Bank. He intended to use that money to buy his first house. In early February, Jeb was presented with a turkey named JEB Stuart by the enemy because it dodged all their bullets and escaped their clutches. Stuart decided to eat his namesake and invited Robert E. Lee to feast. Lee said he had to work. Besides, he said, I could not bear to see JEB Stuart consumed. Jeb also got a dog during this period that he called Beauty. Late April brought the sun, and that dried up the roads, and everyone knew that the year's campaign season was approaching. In early May, Stuart's scouts reported what he already suspected. The Army of the Potomac was on the move, but there were a couple new generals in that army. Ulysses S. Grant, placed as commander of all Union forces, made his headquarters with that army and commanded Meade. Philip Sheridan came east with Grant and took over the cavalry corps, over 10,000 horsemen. Sheridan petitioned Meade to let him strike Stuart, but Meade wanted him to fulfill the traditional cavalry role. The Union army crossed the river that separated the two armies, and Stuart and his cavaliers set off down the Orange Plank Road and found the advancing columns of the blue soldiers. A member of Stuart's staff recalled his commander. Stuart himself, a little in advance of us, with his plumed hat in his hand, looked like an equestrian statue, both man and horse being as motionless as marble, his fine soldierly figure fully revealed in the light of the campfires that were blazing brightly on both sides of the road, as far as the eye could reach, and lighten up the foreground splendidly. Confederate horsemen rode past Stuart in columns of four at full trot, saluting the general with a shout as they galloped toward their designated positions, while the infantry, catching inspiration from their cheers, mingled their loud hurrahs with theirs, in one grand chorus of twice 10,000 voice. It was really a grand spectacle to see these gallant horsemen coming toward us out of the gloom of night into the glare of the fires, making the woods ring with their wild war cries, and the earth tremble beneath their horses' hoofs. The Battle of the Wilderness erupted the next morning, with Stuart leading A.P. Hill's corps to the battle site along the Orange Plank Road. The cavalry operated on the fringes of the engagement, and Stuart himself, going through the thick underbrush of the wilderness, got his uniform ripped and his face cut up with briars. The next day, Stuart led Longstreet's artillery under Edward Porter Alexander to a place that would accommodate the artillery in such a labyrinth of trees and underbrush. Stuart took him to a field, but suspected that enemy skirmishers were in the tree line, but wasn't sure, so he told a courier to ride out and see if he could draw their fire. Before traveling very far, bullets began to fly from the tree line, and one clipped the muzzle of the courier's horse. When the courier returned to Stuart, the horse snorted blood on Stuart. Jeb continued to help the infantry, and when the Battle of the Wilderness came to a close, Stuart and his cavalry headed south and east toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, where the next battle erupted. During the opening phase of that engagement, Stuart commanded infantry and cavalry, placing infantry that came on line near the intersection of the Brock Road and the road leading to Spotsylvania Courthouse. On the Union side, Sheridan and Meade were having a heated discussion. Sheridan still wanted to go after Stuart. Meade said, "Never mind, Stuart, he will do about as he pleases anyhow." Sheridan responded, "I can thrash hell out of him any day." Later, Meade told Grant what Sheridan said, and Grant responded, "Did Sheridan say that? Well, he generally knows what he is talking about. Let him start right out and do it." Sheridan set out on May 9th toward Richmond to draw Stuart away from Lee's army so he could destroy the mounted arm of the Confederate army. Union troops arrived at Beaver Dam Station, destroyed railroad cars and track at that location on May 9th, and moved out early on May 10th. Stuart arrived soon after the enemy departed, and although he was concerned over the loss of supplies, he was more worried about the precious cargo of his family who were staying at Beaver Dam Station. His wife Flora, son Jimmy, and daughter Virginia were safe, and Stuart spent a few moments with Flora, but never dismounted. Before he left, he kissed her and said goodbye to her and the children. As they rode away, one of Stuart's staffers, Andrew Reed Venable, remembered him saying that he never expected to survive the war. He had made the statement before on occasion, but never so seriously. Jeb also said that he didn't want to live if the Confederacy were to lose. Stuart rode all day on the 10th and only stopped at 1 o'clock in the morning on May 11th, when he slept for about 3 hours. Awakened by one of his staff and notified that the enemy was still moving south, Stuart mounted and rode off after Sheridan. By 10 a.m., the Southern cavalry had gotten ahead of the blue columns near an area called Yellow Tavern and prepared to make a stand there. Stuart was concerned about the defenses of Richmond and whether they could hold off Sheridan's troops. He sent Henry McClellan, his aide, to Richmond to ask Jefferson Davis's military advisor, Braxton Bragg, whether he could withstand an attack. In the meantime, Stuart had to make a decision: either block Sheridan from attacking Richmond, or let Sheridan pass and trap him between the defenses of Richmond and himself. Before McClellan could make it back to Stuart, the Cavalier decided on the former, and arrayed his troops along the Telegraph Road, facing west in order to hit Sheridan in the flank as they passed. However, Sheridan was not aiming for Richmond. He was aiming for Stuart. His mission was to eliminate the Southern cavalry. The Union cavalry found the Southern battle line a little before noon on May 11th and began a ferocious assault on the line under the command of General Lunsford Lomax. As Lomax observed the battle with Stuart, the battle line was now directly commanded by Henry Clay Pate, the man Stuart and his cavalry company rescued in Kansas from John Brown years before. Stuart rode up to Pate and told him to hold his line. Pate said, "I will do it," and then Jeb shook his hand warmly. In the attacks by the Federal cavalry, Pate would lose his life, being shot in the head as his men held on to the last possible moment. By the time McClellan found Stuart at about 2 p.m., the left flank had been pushed back, and now the whole battle line faced south. A lull in the battle commenced until 4 p.m., when Sheridan launched another assault with mounted and dismounted troops. Stuart whistled while his iron-gray horse, named General, cantered behind the thin gray line. A mounted Union charge along the Telegraph Road broke through Stuart's line. Stuart himself plugged the breakthrough with his reserve, personally leading them forward. Union soldiers were all around him. Jeb leveled his pistol at enemy troopers and fired. As he rode into the enemy to deliver another volley, a dismounted Federal soldier turned and fired his .44 caliber pistol. The bullet entered Stuart's right side just below the ribs. Stuart reeled in his saddle but didn't fall off. As he grasped his side, his hat fell to the ground and his staff gathered around him, attempting to lead his horse to a safe location, but the horse reared and shied away. His staff then dismounted the general and propped him up against a tree until another horse could be provided. Gus Dorsey, the commander of Company K of the 1st Virginia, stayed with the general. Jeb said, "Dorsey, save your men," but Dorsey refused the order and told his commander that he needed to get him to safety first. As soon as a replacement was found with help, Stuart remounted and rode to the safety of the rear. Fitzhugh Lee came to Stuart while behind the lines, and Stuart told him that the command was his. "Go ahead, Fitz, old fellow. I know you will do what is right." As Stuart lay in the ambulance, he could see some soldiers retreating. He yelled, go back, and do your duty as I have done mine, and our country will be safe. Go back. I had rather die than be whipped." One of his staff officers, Walter Houlihan, who Jeb affectionately called Honeybun, came to see his commander. Jeb asked, "Honeybun, how do I look in the face?" Houlihan said, "General, you are looking right well. You will be all right." Stuart replied, "Well, I don't know how this will turn out, but if it is God's will that I shall die, I am ready." Knowing that whiskey would help Stuart's suffering, Dr. John Fontaine encouraged the general to drink some, but Jeb refused, referring back to his vow to his mother as a little boy to never take a sip of alcohol. His staff encouraged him to drink some to ease the pain, and after repeated requests, Stuart drank a little. He was only a few miles from Richmond, but because of the battle, the ambulance had to take unorthodox roads. After dark, the wounded general arrived at his brother-in-law, Dr. Charles Brewer's home on Grace Street in Richmond. All they could do was apply ice to the wound. His caretakers tried to get a telegraph to Flora at Beaver Dam Station, but because Sheridan's men had cut the telegraph wires, she didn't receive word of the wounding until about noon on May 12th. Her and the Edmund Fontaine family she was staying with were taking care of wounded men from the Spotsylvania battlefield when the message got to her. Edmund Fontaine was the president of the Virginia Central Railroad and would get her a private train to see her husband. However, they could only make it so far because Sheridan had destroyed the tracks near Richmond, so they found an army ambulance and made the trip over the rough roads to Richmond. Through the night of the 11th, Stuart suffered in pain, but was alert and lucid until the morning of the 12th. Knowing he was going to die, Stuart began to get his affairs in order. He told McClellan, "I wish you to take one of my horses, and Andrew Reed Venable the other. Which is the heavier rider?" McClellan said that Venable was. Stuart replied, "Then let Venable have the gray horse, and you take the bay." He then told McClellan to look inside his hat band, and he would find a small Confederate flag which a woman in Columbia, South Carolina had sent him earlier in the war, and he wished it returned to her. He directed McClellan to send his spurs to Miss Lily Lee of Shepherdstown, Virginia, and his sword to be given to his son. About that time, Jefferson Davis entered the room and asked, "General, how do you feel?" Stuart replied, "Easy, but willing to die, if God and my country think I have fulfilled my destiny and done my duty." It was getting late in the afternoon, and Stuart began to suffer from agonizing pain. He asked Dr. Brewer if he would survive the night. "No," Brewer said gently. Stuart then said, "I am resigned if it be God's will, but I would like to see my wife. But God's will be done." Around 7 p.m., everyone in the house gathered around his bed. His favorite hymn, Rock of Ages, was sung. He attempted to join in, but was too weak. Once the song was over, Stuart exclaimed, "I am going fast now. I am resigned. God's will be done." He drifted off into unconsciousness, and at 7:38 p.m., his breathing ceased. Flora would arrive at 11:30 that night. As she entered the home, she noticed the quiet of the people and knew that the worst had happened. The next day, a funeral was held, with Generals Braxton Bragg, John P. McCown, Robert Chilton, and Alexander Lawton acting as some of the pallbearers. He was laid to rest in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. There was no military display. All the troops were fighting. However, the booming of cannons in the distance acted as a salute to the fallen commander. Stuart wrote out his will in November of 1861. He left everything he owned to Flora and the children, but he owned very little. The will gave a gold pencil to his daughter Flora, who had since died. He left his class ring, diplomas, commissions, and clothes to his wife, his sword to Jimmy. He expressed his wish that his children be raised south of the Mason-Dixon line, and that his family always live in the South. He owned very little, but the most precious and most valuable thing he owned was his name. His name gave a lot of people and his family the ability to financially support themselves. John Eston Cook, Stuart's unofficial publicist, became famous for his novels and stories about Stuart. Harris von Borcke, the large Prussian aide to Stuart, recovered from his wounds he received in June of 1863, even visited Stuart on the general's deathbed. Von would write accounts of Stuart that were published in Prussia as well as the United States. Until his dying day, Von flew a Confederate flag from a tower on his castle in Prussia. Henry McClellan, Stuart's aide, became Stuart's official biographer, creating the most intimate biography of Stuart. Virginia Pelham Stuart, Jeb's youngest child, would get married and live in Norfolk, Virginia, where she would die after giving birth in 1898. James Yule Brown Stuart II, Little Jimmy, would eventually join the United States Army, the same army his father served in and resigned from to fight for the Confederacy. Jimmy would obtain the rank of captain and die in 1930 at the age of 70. Flora would live the rest of her life in the South, even though her father attempted to convince her to come north. She would always be referred to as Mrs. General JEB Stuart. She took a job as the principal of the Virginia Female Institute in Stanton, Virginia. She would die on May 10, 1923, at the age of 87. After her husband's death, she never wore any other color than the black of mourning. Robert E. Lee said of Stuart, "He never brought me a piece of false information, and I can scarcely think of him without weeping." Lee and Stuart had known each other since Jeb's time at West Point, and had only grown closer, with Lee basically acting as a father figure to Stuart. One biographer went as far as calling Lee Stuart's surrogate father. Jeb Stuart was the quintessential cavalryman. The flamboyant Stuart secured Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, bringing it great information about the enemy and screened its movements, making it successful in its various campaigns. Lee's generalship was strengthened by Stuart's horsemanship, because an army commander is only as good as the information provided about the enemy. Did Stuart act extravagant? Yes. But was he great at his job? Absolutely. And no one performed cavalry operations better than Jeb Stuart. Lee's successes were possible to a great deal because of the abilities of Jeb Stuart, and it's more than a coincidence that Lee's greatest defeat at Gettysburg happened when Stuart wasn't with him. Of course, there is plenty of blame to go around, and it's wrong to place it all on Stuart. There were many factors that led to that defeat. Jeb became a legend in his own time, and that legend became difficult for Stuart to live up to at all times, although he tried and succeeded in doing so a great deal. His legend only grew after he died, with his image becoming synonymous with the dashing Cavalier, and Stuart embodying that idealized and romantic image. Over 70 years after the end of the Civil War, during the Second World War, the U.S. developed a light tank named the Stuart, named after the cavalryman. Despite his faults, Jeb Stuart will be remembered as he would have wanted, as the loving and seemingly carefree cavalier who feared nothing and made the Union Army and its cavalry look foolish in their attempts to capture him. Despite the attacks leveled at him by his contemporaries and historians, he still rides through history, symbolizing the romantic cavalier.